Okay. Best and worst reads of 2022. G'day to all you lovely people and welcome back to my channel. Today I wanted to talk about my least favourite and favourite books that I read in 2022. I've been wanting to do this video for a while, I just haven't got around to it. Now you need to keep in mind that I read a lot of books last year, more than I think I ever have. It's somewhere in the region of 140. So there are going to be a lot that I liked, but surprisingly there weren't a lot that I didn't enjoy. There were a few I really hated, but not that many. And I am going to start with the books I didn't like, my least favourite reads of last year. But I should also mention that this is just my opinion of these books. It doesn't necessarily mean they are bad books. They just didn't appeal to me. Though I would argue perhaps the last two that I'll talk about are just bad books. Anyway, so let's start. The first book I wanted to talk about was Forces of Nature by Jane Harper, an Australian author. This is meant to be a murder mystery. This is the second book of Harper's that I read. I have also read The Dry, which I really liked except for the ending. I felt very dissatisfied with the ending. I didn't think she had laid enough groundwork to set up this ending. And I felt that Forces of Nature was worse when it came to the ending. It felt like such a cop-out and it kind of spoiled my enjoyment of the book. Personally, I think she would be better off just writing fiction, not necessarily mysteries, because this one had all this great build-up, but the resolutions in 2 books so far were very disappointing for me. Also, there were certain things that happened in the book which just didn't ring true, and that bothered me as well. It doesn't mean I'm not going to read any more of her books. I think I have another 2. I just didn't enjoy this one. The next books I wanted to talk about were 2 by Ben Aaronovitch, part of his Rivers of London series, an urban fantasy about a policeman, Peter, who also has magical abilities. I was really excited about reading this because it is a long series, but it didn't appeal to me. Not because they're necessarily bad, but this series I did not enjoy, and I read 3 books altogether. The author has this propensity of putting in far too much minutiae. They're driving down London, they take a right on this street, a left on this street. Frankly, it was so unnecessary and just dragged the book down for me. I do like some of the humour he has in it, but overall, by the end of the 3rd book, which I think was Whispers Underground, I decided this series is not for me and I'm not going to continue it. I wasn't that invested in the characters or the mythology that he had created. It just left me bored, actually. That doesn't mean I may never read them, but I don't think it's likely. The next one was The Final Empire, the first book in the Mistborn trilogy by Brandon Sanderson. This one I really struggled to finish. I did not like the writing. I thought it was far too simplistic for a fantasy that is supposedly an adult one. I really felt this was more geared towards a young audience, and there was a lot of exposition, and there were just enough issues with this series that it was a struggle. I also really hated one of the main characters, and if that happens, it's very hard for me to get interested enough to want to continue it. When I first finished The Final Empire, I thought I might pick up the second, but I've since decided that it's not for me. It was disappointing because there are a lot of books in this universe. I think it's called the Cosmere, and I was hoping I would love them and just want to read them all. And now I'm a bit hesitant to read the next one. Though I do feel I need to try at least another, if not two other books before I decide Sanderson isn't for me. But I know that is an unpopular opinion. Many people love the Mistborn trilogy. It just wasn't one that appealed to me. No. Another book I didn't like is a classic by Virginia Woolf, Orlando. I like some aspects of the book, but overall this was not one I really enjoyed all that much, though I know that some people consider it iconic. And I guess it is in a way. It was just not one that I found particularly stimulating. I sometimes felt really bogged down in the writing, though at other times I loved certain themes that she raised. It was just not one that I came away thinking, wow, I love this and I want to reread it. No. And the last two books that I'm going to talk about, I just think they're bad books. You may not agree, but that's fine, right? We can't all like the same books, but I think it goes beyond my just hating them. I just think they were very poorly written. The first one is Robinson Crusoe by Defoe. This is an old classic. It's considered, I think, the first English-speaking novel. And wow, this one was so badly written. The writing was very poor. It was also extremely repetitive. It was another book that dealt too much with minutiae and then would repeat it over and over again. So by the end, I was just so done with it, though I wanted to know how it finished. I also absolutely detested the character of Robinson Crusoe. The only thing I liked about his character was how resourceful he was in surviving on a deserted island. But I do believe if this book was written today, it would not be accepted because it is far too repetitive and the writing was quite poor. Definitely one I hated and will never read again. No. There were sequels, but after finishing Robinson Crusoe, I thought, yeah, there's no way I can handle this author's writing style, so I won't be reading those, no. And the final one, which if you've watched my channel, you are probably not going to be surprised, is The Guest List by Lucy Foley. Wow. I hated this book so much. I actually didn't read it entirely. I skimmed at least half of the book, if not 2/3. I detested this book. I hated it for so many reasons. One was that it did not read like a murder mystery. It read more like a book about relationships, and I found all the characters dislikable. I don't think there was one that I actually liked reading about. I also think that the author was trying to be very clever by showing us several viewpoints, and she just didn't carry it off. There were too many stereotypes. The murder mystery itself was so badly executed that I almost threw the book across the room at the end because I thought, no, this is just rubbish. Now, I'm sure that some people like it, and I know it has awesome reviews on Goodreads, but that just goes to show that not all of us like the same things in a book. And when I'm reading a murder mystery, I'm curious about the mystery. I want clues to try to work it out. I just didn't feel that this was a murder mystery. And worst is, I read so many articles where they were saying this was similar to And Then There Were None by Agatha Christie. And wow, that's such an insult to Agatha Christie's book because it is nothing whatsoever like it. I know I can keep ranting about it, but I'm going to stop here because I've already done a video on this and I really went to town there. But this was the book I liked the absolute least. Oh, let's be honest, this is the book I hated the most from last year, and it's not one I would recommend to anyone. Anyway, they were my least favourite reads of last year. Not that many, really, is it? Considering I read so many overall. And I have so many favourites from last year that I think this video may be a little bit too long. Now, These are in no particular order except for the last three, which were my absolute favorites. The first one I wanted to talk about was War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells. I have read The Time Machine, which I really liked, but I liked War of the Worlds a lot more because it was set, I think, during the turn of the century or in the late 1800s, when humanity didn't have things like planes or motorized transport, and they were fighting an alien invasion. I found that really fascinating, actually, to see how they dealt with it. And Wells was a very good writer. I found I was engaged. I really felt for some of the characters and their disbelief that an alien species was invading their world and destroying it. This was something I really enjoyed reading. And I generally do struggle reading books where I already know the story, but I think because this was set much earlier than most film adaptations I've seen, I enjoyed it. Thoroughly recommend it if you haven't read it. I also read The Stepford Wives by, I think it's Ira Levin. This one was really interesting. I've seen the films, I think the original as well as the remake. It's a fascinating idea of women being molded, shaped to fit men's ideals. As a feminist, of course, I was very offended at what the men did and expected of these women. But this was written at the time of women's liberation. I think it was in the 60s or 70s. And the fear that some men had in relation to women becoming too powerful, I guess, or independent. It is a satire, but it's very well written and very spare writing. I don't know how to describe the writing, but I really liked Levin's style and I want to read some more books by him. Again, something well worth reading. The next one were the Alex Verus books by Benedict Jacker. This is the only series I think I've read where I hated the main character, but that's what made these books so fascinating for me. I just had to know what was going to happen. And because they are written in the first person, you get to really understand the main character, Alex Verus. These are urban fantasy set in London, and I really like Jacker's writing style. It's very spare. The books are not very thick like some fantasy, though there are a few. I think there's 13 or 14. I can't recall now. I was overall extremely happy with the series, though I hated the ending with a passion. Sometimes I just don't stick the endings, if you ask me. But despite that, it didn't take away my real enjoyment of this series and an insight into what I think is a despicable character. Yeah. I also loved Alice in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll. I have seen the films, of course, but I just loved his writing style. It was so funny, actually, which really surprised me. And let's not forget how imaginative his world is. That was a very, very pleasant surprise, though I did not like the sequel as much. But Alice in Wonderland was definitely a favourite of last year. I also have to mention the Poirot books by Agatha Christie. I love these books. I just finished them and I want to reread them again because I just thoroughly enjoyed them. The mysteries are so cleverly plotted. She was excellent at plots. I think so. And I really love Christie's style, though there are some issues sometimes with her writing. She can be casually racist at times, which I think reflects more the times that these were written, which was in the 20s onwards. And I noticed there was a lot less of that in future books. But despite that, it's a glimpse, I guess, into our history, because many of these books take place in the 20s or 30s. They felt almost like historical books, which is so strange. But the mysteries are so well worth it. though I do think some of her later ones I didn't enjoy as much because Poirot himself didn't feature as much in some of the books that she had. He was just a very minor character, which annoyed me. I wanted more Poirot because I adore him. Yeah. The other series which I am just loving is Terry Pratchett's Discworld books. I actually thought I'd only read 12, but I read 15. I was hoping to have read up to 20 last year. I didn't get around to it. And the last, I'd say, 6 or 7 of the Discworld books I just adored. Particularly Reaper Man with Death and Witches Abroad with Granny Weatherwax, my 2 favourite characters from this series. I also really liked Men at Arms, but I had heard that this was a really good book in the mini series regarding the guards. Another book I really loved was Small Gods, but I'm thinking I might do a video about how I'm finding the Discworlds up to now, so I won't go into further detail except to say if you have not read Pratchett, then you have missed out on really, really funny books that also have a lot of commentary about society, about the absurdity of humanity at times. These are definitely becoming some of my favourite books. Then there was The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, part of the Narnia series by C.S. Lewis. I think I loved that one so much because I was very nostalgic about it. It was, I think, the first one I read when I was a child, and I just adored it. I loved the characters, I loved the story. Yeah, it was just magical. I think I could reread these again in the future, though God knows when, because I have so many books that I still want to read. But if you've never read the Narnia series, I highly recommend the entire series. I will say some books are better than others though, and The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe is definitely my favourite. The Louise Penny Inspector Gamache series. Up to today, I have read 10 of them. I think last year I had read 4, and I loved this series. I love the characters. I love the setting, which is this small, idyllic little village in Quebec, Canada. I love learning about Quebec society, many things I didn't know about it. And I really think the mysteries are done very well, though I don't think that is the particular strength of the books. I think the characters are. They are just so charming, including Gamache and the residents of this village called Three Pines, that I just adore them and I love seeing them interacting. These are becoming some of my favourites, and I have now read 10 and I still have another 7, but I'm saving them for a little bit later. If you like murder mysteries, I highly recommend the Louise Penny books. The Thrawn Trilogy by Timothy Zahn. As far as I'm concerned, Zahn has been the only author that I have read who has captured the Star Wars characters so perfectly. I have read this series several times. I read it when it first came out in the 90s, and I really wish that they had made these the sequel films, not the ones that we got. Not that I hate the films, except for the third. I don't really like the third all that much, but this story by Zahn is just so well done, and his introduction of several characters like Card or Mara Jade, and particularly Thrawn, the villain, I guess, adds so much to this overall story. In fact, I would argue that Thrawn is one of the best villains that I have ever read. And in addition to this trilogy, there is also a duology. I think it's called The Hand of Thrawn, which I love just as much. Zahn has also written 2 other trilogies based on the character of Thrawn, which I'm really looking forward to reading. He was just fascinating and so well written and explored that I just am very curious to learn more about this character, about his history in particular. Other books that I really loved were two books by Richard Osman, The Thursday Murder Club, and I think it was The Man Who Died Twice. Yeah. I just love these. These are so charming, so funny about growing old. It is about a group of elderly people in a retirement village who investigate murders. They are just so well written. The characters are very well drawn and realistic, I thought. And it's nice to read about characters who aren't all just young whippersnappers, but in the twilight of their lives. Their worries, their concerns, as well as their passion, which they still have. I absolutely love these books, and I bought them in hardcover. I love them so much. There is a new one out, but I have just read that a fourth is coming out later in the year, so I'm going to wait until that one's out and then I'll read the next two as well. If you love murder mysteries and reading about what it is like to be older, which I think he captures so well, then I think you'll love these books. Then I have to include Caves of Steel by Isaac Asimov. I am fairly new to science fiction. I've read a little bit here and there, but not many of the classics. And I kind of want to get into reading some of the classics like Asimov or Arthur C. Clarke, etc. And I started with Asimov. I read some of his robot short stories, and then I thought I'll read one of the novels, which is Caves of Steel. I loved it. In fact, I have now finished the series, but at the time it was the first one that I had read, and I just thought it was so clever. His vision of our future is a little depressing if you ask me. But of course, it is the involvement of robots and his 3 laws of robotics and how people interact with robots that I found so fascinating. It was enough for me to buy the rest of the books, and yeah, I just love them. I highly recommend them if you haven't read them. They're kind of iconic, I believe. They're definitely classic science fiction and well worth reading. Then I reread 1984 by George Orwell. This book can be so depressing, but it is just so brilliant. I love this book. I think the first time I read it, I was in my 20s, and now I'm in my late 50s, and I can see parallels with our own world, which is so scary. The use of propaganda, the totalitarian rule of the government, this overwhelming need for us to conform. Yeah, it's everything that I loathe, and yet I can recognize, though obviously this is much more exaggerated, but I can recognize parts of it in our own society, which is scary. It was fantastic, as it was the first time, though it can be a little bit depressing. Still, I think it's one that everyone should read, definitely. And I guess since we're talking classics, the other one that I just adored was Fahrenheit 451, which I had never read before, by Ray Bradbury. This was about book burning, which, yeah, is something close to my heart because I don't believe we should burn books ever. Regardless, it was also just so prophetic about where our lives would be. And it was written in the 50s. This book blew my mind. Yeah, I can't deny it. I loved it, and I think I'm going to reread it soon, though I'm not sure when. Again, this is a dystopian view, I guess, of our future. Definitely was one of my absolute favourites from last year. And the other one was Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, which I had never read because I'd seen way too many films of it. I think sometimes we forget that the actual book isn't about the monster. It is about Frankenstein, the creator of the monster. And I found this book so poignant, actually. And I loved it. I loved the writing. It is absolutely beautifully written. And she was a very well-read woman, so her writing reflects that. It was also a heartbreaking story, I can't deny it, but this was a book that I can see myself reading again. Definitely one of my favorites from last year as well. And the last three. Again, in no particular order, but these were the ones I loved the most. I'll start off first with the Witcher series by Andrzej Sapkowski. I love these books. Yeah, I flew through them when I got into it, though I will admit it took me a little bit of time to get into it. There's a lot of contradictory advice online as to which order you should read the books. I read the short stories and prequels first, and then I read the novels, which is a 5-book series. I'm actually glad I did, because many of the references in the novels you won't pick up unless you have read the prequel short stories. Though it took me a bit of time to get into it because I'm not a big fan of short stories. I should also mention that English isn't Sapkowski's first language, and sometimes the translation seems clunky. I think that is just how translations work sometimes. Phrases in a particular language may not translate so easily into English. And whilst it took me a little bit of time to grow accustomed to the language used, I found that I really enjoyed these books because the story was wonderful. I loved how many themes he raises about society, which applies today as well as back then, which I think these were written in the 80s. These are really wonderful books and I highly recommend them. Though perhaps it may not be to everyone's taste. Some people might find that the writing just doesn't work for them, which I can understand, but persevere, and I think you will be well rewarded for it. And the other series that I just loved was the Red Rising series by Pierce Brown, the original trilogy. There are 2 other books in a subsequent series. There is a 3rd one coming out soon, but I've read that Brown is also going to do a 4th, and I haven't read those until that series is finished. But I'm only talking about Red Rising. Wow, I love this series. Absolutely could not put it down. It is a futuristic dystopian world, which also has people living on other planets like Mars. And people are divided based on colours. Reds, yellows, whites, golds, etc. The reds are usually the lowest level of this society. And I just love this commentary on distinctions, class distinctions in particular. Basically, the way this society has been structured, people are placed in a particular colour and they're not expected to advance whatsoever. You're either born into a particular class or colour or you're not. Well, these books kind of turns everything on its head. One of the characters, a lowly red, I think the lowest denomination in this society, actually does advance. And this overall story is about, I guess, a revolution of the downtrodden. That is probably the best description. I loved these books. I absolutely adored them. It has become one of my favourite series, and I know I'm going to reread it again, possibly when the others are finished. Then I'll read the whole thing all together. I have seen some criticisms of these books that they're derivative. I disagree with that. Personally, I don't know if there's any originality left because we have got millions of books out there, but it's a question of how people use an idea that they have read about before. It's a question of how they adapt it for their story. And this story felt very original and fresh. And I highly recommend it, definitely. And the last book. This one blew my mind. Yeah, I love this book so much and I'm going to be reading it again as well in the future. And that is Dark Matter by Blake Crouch. This one left me with thousands of questions, and to this day I still think about so many issues that it raised. It is written in the first person, which is never my favourite narrative but it doesn't matter. I just absolutely loved this book, the ideas that it raised. I have done videos on many of these favourites that I've talked about, so I don't want to go into a lot of detail except to say that when I finished that, I thought, I want to read everything by this author, which doesn't happen to me very often. And I have also read a second book called Recursion, which I really enjoyed, though I like Dark Matter better. And I should mention that this is a story about alternate dimensions and how shaped are we, not just by our nature, but also by our environment and our choices. Yeah, this one was a real mind bender, if you ask me, and I think that's why I loved it so much. So that is my least favourite and favourite books of 2022. Now I would love to know what your favourite and least favourite books were. You can let me know down in the comments, or you can contact me on Instagram. Thank you so very much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed this video. And I also hope I might have inspired you to read something that I loved, or not read something that I really didn't like. I hope you all have a beautiful day, and I will see you next time. Bye.